Hello, my name is John, and today we'll be reading Karl Marx, Howling, Gigantic Curses by Paul Johnson from his book Intellectuals. Karl Marx has had more impact on actual events as well as on the minds of men and women than any other intellectual in modern times. The reason for this is not primarily the attraction of his concepts and methodology, though both have a strong appeal to unrigorous minds, but the fact that his philosophy has been institutionalized in two of the world's largest countries, Russia and China, and their many satellites. The kind of personal dictatorship he envisioned for himself was actually carried into effect with incalculable consequences for mankind by his three most important followers, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, all of whom in this respect were faithful Marxists. He felt he had found a scientific explanation of human behavior in history akin to Darwin's theory of evolution. This has spilled over into non-Marxist world, for intellectuals, especially academics, are fascinated by power, and the identification of Marxism with massive physical authority has tempted many teachers to admit Marxist science to their own disciplines, especially such inexact or quasi-exact subjects as economics, sociology, history, and geography. No doubt if Hitler rather than Stalin had won the struggle for Central and Eastern Europe in 1941 through 45 and so imposed his will on a great part of the world, Nazi doctrines, which also claimed to be scientific, such as its race theory, would have been given an academic gloss and penetrated universities throughout the world. But military victory ensured that Marxist rather than Nazi science would prevail. In 1842, he became a journalist for 5 months until he was banned in 1843. He thereafter wrote for journals in Paris until his expulsion in 1845. In Brussels, he became involved in organizing the Communist League and wrote its manifesto in 1848. After the failure of the revolution, he was forced to move and in 1849 settled in London for good. But most of his time in London until his death in 1883, that is, 34 years, was spent in the British Museum finding material for a gigantic study of capital and trying to get it into publishable shape. But in a deeper sense, he was not really a scholar, not a scientist at all. He was not interested in finding truth, but in proclaiming it. There were three strands in Marx: the poet, the journalist, and the moralist. Together, and in combination with his enormous will, they made him a formidable writer and seer. But there was nothing scientific about him. Indeed, in all that matters, he was anti-scientific. 2 poems were published in 1841 entitled Savage Songs, and savagery is a characteristic of his verse, together with intense pessimism about the human condition, hatred, a fascination with corruption and violence, suicide pacts with the devil. He has himself, in the person of God, say, "I shall howl gigantic curses at mankind." Below the surface of his poetry is the notion of a general world crisis building up. He was fond of quoting from Faust, "Everything that exists deserves to perish." The apocalyptic vision of an immense impending catastrophe on the existing system remained with him throughout his life. It is there in the poetry. It is the background to the Communist Manifesto of 1848, and it is a climax of capital itself. Marx is an eschatological writer from start to finish. His concept of doomsday, whether in its poetic version or its eventually economic one, is an artistic, not a scientific vision. It is the poetic element which gives Marx's historical projection its drama and its fascination to radical readers who want to believe that the death and judgment of capitalism is coming. Marx was well suited to write short, sharp, opinionated reactions to events as they occurred. He believed, as his poetic imagination told him, that society was on the verge of collapse. So almost everything, big news stories could be related to this general principle, giving his journalism a remarkable consistency. Marx sought academic fame by what he saw as his sensational discovery of the fatal flaw in Hegel's method, which enabled him to replace the entire Hegelian system with a new philosophy. Indeed, a super philosophy which would make all existing philosophies outmoded. Marx believed the dialectic was the key to human understanding. The dialectic and its contradictions explain the culminating universal crisis which was his original poetic vision as a teenager. Business cycles express the contradictions inherent in capitalist society and will produce the culmination point of these cycles, a universal crisis, he wrote. What did any of this have to do with the politics and economics of the real world? Nothing whatever. Just as the origin of Marx's philosophy lay in a poetic vision, so its elaboration was an exercise in academic jargonizing. What is needed, however, to set Marx's intellectual machinery in motion was a moral impulse. He found it in his hatred of usury and moneylenders, a passionate feeling directly related to his own money difficulties. This found expression in Marx's first serious writings, 2 essays on the Jewish question, published in 1844. Hegel's followers were all in varying degrees anti-Semitic. In 1843, Bruno Bauer, the anti-Semitic leader of the Hegelian left, published an essay demanding that the Jews abandon Judaism completely. Marx's essays were a reply to this. He did not object to Bauer's anti-Semitism. Indeed, he shared it, endorsed it, and quoted it with approval, but he disagreed with Bauer's solution. Marx rejected Bauer's belief that the antisocial nature of the Jew was religious in origin and could be remedied by tearing the Jew away from his faith. In Marx's opinion, evil was social and economic. Marx asked, what is the worldly god of the Jew? Money. The Jews had spread this practical religion to all society. Money is the jealous god of Israel, beside which no other god may exist. The Jew had corrupted the Christian and convinced him he has no other destiny here below than to become richer than his neighbors. Abolish the Jewish attitude to money, and both the Jew and his religion, and the corrupt version of Christianity he had imposed on the world, would disappear. Thus far, Marx's explanation what was wrong with the world was a combination of student cafe anti-Semitism and Rousseau. He broadened it into his mature philosophy over the next 3 years, from 1844 to 1846, during which he decided that the evil element in society, the agents of the usurious money power from which he revolted, were not just the Jews, but the bourgeoisie class as a whole. To do this, he made elaborate use of Hegel's dialectic. On the one hand, there was the money power, wealth, capital, the instrument of the bourgeoisie class, and on the other there was a new redemptive force, the proletariat. The revolution consists of two elements. The head of emancipation is philosophy. Its heart is the proletariat. Thus, the intellectuals would form the elite, the generals, the workers, the foot soldiers. Socialism cannot be brought into existence without revolution, he wrote. Marx had an ambivalent attitude to the facts, as he had to Hegel's philosophy, but these were the facts to be found in libraries. The kind of facts which did not interest Marx were the facts to be discovered by examining the world and the people who live in it with his own eyes and ears. Capital, the monument around which his life as a scholar revolved, should be seen not as a scientific investigation of the economic process it purported to describe, but as an exercise in moral philosophy. It is a huge and often incoherent sermon, an attack on the industrial process and the principle of ownership by a man who had conceived a powerful but essentially irrational hatred for them. This is not a scientific analysis in any sense, but a simple prophecy. There will be, Marx says, number one, a progressive diminution in the number of the capitalist magnates. Number two, a corresponding increase in the mass of poverty, oppression, enslavement, degeneration, and exploitation. Number three, a steady intensification of the wrath of the working class. The centralization of the means of production and the socialization of labor reach a point where they prove incompatible with their capitalist husk. This bursts asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated, he wrote. His thesis was that capitalism produces ever worsening conditions. The more capital employed, the more badly the workers had to be treated to secure adequate returns. Marx is dealing with pre-capitalist conditions and ignoring the truth which stared him in the face. The more capital, the less suffering. What Marx could not, would not grasp, because he made no effort to understand how industry worked, was that from the very dawn of the Industrial Revolution, from 760 to 1790, the most efficient manufacturers, who had ample access to capital, habitually favored better conditions for their workforce. They therefore tended to support factory legislation and its enforcement because it eliminated what they regarded as unfair competition. So conditions improved, and because conditions improved, the workers failed to rise, as Marx predicted they would. The profit was thus confounded. What emerges from reading of Capital is Marx's fundamental failure to understand capitalism. He failed precisely because he was unscientific. He would not investigate the facts himself or use objectively the facts investigated by others. From start to finish, not just Capital but all his work reflects a disregard for the truth which at times amounts to contempt. If Marx then, though in appearance a scholar, was not motivated by a love of truth, what was the energizing force in his life? To discover this, we have to look much more closely at his personal character. His work and its content can be related to four aspects of his character: his taste for violence, his appetite for power, his inability to handle money, and his tendency to exploit those around him. The undertone of violence, always present in Marxism and constantly exhibited by the actual behavior of Marxist regimes, was a projection of the man himself. Marx lived his life in an atmosphere of extreme verbal violence, periodically exploding into violent rows and sometimes physical assault. Much of Marx's time was spent in collecting elaborate dossiers about his political rivals and enemies, which he did not scruple to feed to the police if he thought it would serve his turn. That Marx, once established in power, would have been capable of great violence and cruelty seems certain. But of course he was never in a position to carry out large-scale revolution, violent or otherwise, and his pent-up rage therefore passed into his books, which always have a tone of intransigence and extremism. In due course, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao Zedong practiced on an enormous scale the violence which Marx felt in his heart and which his works exude. Marx does not believe in God, but he believes much in himself and makes everyone serve himself. His heart is not full of love, but of bitterness, and he has little sympathy for the human race. A contemporary Bakunin said of him. Marx's habitual anger, his dictatorial habits, and his bitterness reflected, no doubt, his justified consciousness of great powers and his intense frustration at his inability to exercise them more effectively. His angry egotism had physical as well as psychological roots. He led a particularly unhealthy life, smoked heavily, drank a lot of alcohol, and kept irregular hours of sleep. He rarely took baths or washed much at all. This and his unsuitable diet explain the veritable plague of boils from which he suffered for a quarter of a century. Still more central to his anger and frustration, and lying perhaps at the very roots of his hatred for the capitalist system, was his grotesque incompetence in handling money. As a young man, it drove him into the hands of money-lenders at high rates of interest, and a passionate hatred of usury was the real emotional dynamic of his whole moral philosophy. It explains why he devoted so much time and space to the subject, why his entire theory of class is rooted in anti-Semitism, and why he included in Capital a long and violent passage denouncing usury, which he culled from one of Luther's anti-Semitic diatribes. Marx borrowed money heedlessly, spent it, then was invariably astounded and angry when the heavily discounted bills plus interest became due. He saw the charging of interest, essential as it is to any system based on capital, as a crime against humanity, and at the root of the exploitation of man by man, which his entire system was designed to eliminate. Money dominates his family correspondence. He had already adopted a pattern of living off loans from friends and gouging periodic sums from the family. Marx rationalized this by saying his family was quite rich, and his work was all important. Other than intermittent journalism, the purpose of which was political rather than earn money, Marx never seriously attempted to get a job. His mother refused to pay his debts, believing he would simply contract more and eventually cut him off completely. She is credited with the bitter wish that Karl would accumulate capital instead of just writing about it. But of course, the principal victims of Marx's improvidence and unwillingness to work were his own household, his wife above all. Jenny Marx is one of the tragic, pitiful figures of socialist history. She had the clear Scottish coloring, pale skin, green eyes, and auburn hair of her paternal grandmother, descended from the second Earl of Argyll, killed at Flodden. She was a beauty and Marx loved her. His poems prove it, and she loved him passionately, fighting his battles both with her family and his own. It took many years of bitterness for her love to die. Marx was proud of his wife's noble Scottish descent and her position as the daughter of a baron and senior official in the Prussian government. But from the beginning of 1848, and for at least the next 10 years, her life was a nightmare. Marx became a part of the bourgeoisie, which he despised, mainly due to Engels. This led Marx to another form of exploitation, this time of his daughters. He denied them a satisfactory education, refused to allow them to get any training, and vetoed careers absolutely. In December of 1882, he exulted at his growing influence in Russia. "Nowhere is my success more delightful," he wrote. Destructive to the end, he boasted that "it gives me the satisfaction that I damage a power which, next to England, is the true bulwark of the old society." Marx's vision of the dictatorship of the proletariat had taken concrete and terrifying shape, and Lenin, together with Stalin, the ruler who achieved the absolute power for which Marx had yearned, was just beginning his catastrophic assault on the Russian peasantry. This video is a production of the School of the White Crane. My name is John Brooker, and you could reach me through commentary on this video or through my Gmail listed here. Please share this video with family and friends and on social media. May God richly bless you.